Okay, so I'm going to discuss King Philip's War, which was talked about fairly briefly in the uh, documentary you watched last unit. So there was a lot of pressure being put on the Wampanoag and other southern New England tribes uh, throughout the entire 17th century because the colonist population kept going up, the native population kept going down or remaining stagnant, and as a result, the various tribes felt a lot of tension coming at them from the colonial the colonial growth, a lot of pressure on them. So the Wampanoag had been some of the first to welcome the English, and after the second generation uh, came of age, the colonists were less interested in maintaining the relationships that their parents had made. So the Wampanoag in particular felt under pressure, but all these tribes in the area, the Massachusetts had been pretty much wiped out by disease. But the Nipmuc, Pocumtuck in particular, Narragansett, we talked about the Pequot War last time, the Mohegan, the Niantic, the Nauset, all these folks, the Southern Algonquians that lived in New England, they were all struggling to manage the continuing encroachment on their lands, and there were various ways this encroachment happened, which the documentary talked about. Um, Ways that they were defrauded out of their land. So one example is through the use of pigs. Um, Under English common law, a if your pig wandered onto unclaimed land, then you could claim that land legally, and the English just interpreted all of native land as being unclaimed, and so when their animals would walk on it, they would say, "Oh, this is my land now," and just legally appropriate it. Uh, Not cool. The natives were very unhappy about that. So eventually, what happened was the breakout of what was called King Philip's War. And normally I would talk about this more, but we've got to speed this up. So, what started King Philip's War was, interestingly enough, and a lot of my own research in my career was on King Philip's War. If I had been doing the research now, I would definitely take a different approach to it because there was almost a Native Lives Matter kind of movement going on. The natives were very conscious of the unfairness of the English legal and law enforcement systems. So, and a lot of the documents I looked at were legal documents kept by the colonies. And so, for example, something would get stolen from somebody and they'd go to the authorities about it, go to the colonial police in the town. And the police would just assume it was the nearby native person that stole whatever thing it was, whether it was a calf or a pig or a tool or a plow or whatever. So natives would get blamed for any crime. And so anytime an English person would see a native person, they'd start to think criminal. And this started to get, you started to see this in the legal system in the 1650s and 60s in the colonial records, where the colonists just assume that any crime going on is due to natives in their midst. And King Philip, Metacom, he was quite conscious of this and upset about it and resentful. And he one time was logged as actually saying, "We can put up 100 of our best people who will swear that this person is a good person. You, the English, will put up one of your most loser drunks." He didn't actually call him that, but one of your lowest men, I think he said. And you will all believe him as if he's telling the truth, but you won't believe our best people when they swear they're telling the truth. And as a result, any crime would just get blamed on the natives. And this reached a climax in the spring and summer of 1675, when the prior winter there had been a murder of a man named John Sassamon, who was a native, but he worked for the English, and he was found in a pond dead. And the English investigation found that these three associates of Philip had accomplished the murder. There was no strong proof, and Philip was livid that his friends were being blamed for this murder when there wasn't any good proof, and then they were hanged. And so then Philip's people got very angry, and there were some attacks on the town. The first attacks were in a town called Swansea, which is down over here close to Mount Hope, was down here in southern Rhode Island. And some of Philip's warriors attacked Swansea. And then a conflict broke out. The interesting thing about it was that Philip didn't really have many warriors at first, but he kept on escaping much larger colonial police forces trying to capture him, and military forces. So hundreds of militia members would be chasing him, and he'd have maybe 20 guys, and they would somehow defeat this much larger force. And they kept on, every time they would escape capture, they'd gain notoriety and what the natives called, Southern Algonquins called Manitou. Manitou is like a spiritual energy that was part of their religion. So I could talk about this a long time, but generally what happened is Philip's reputation went up, and he tapped into, so if you think of the recent Black Lives Matter movement, how this resentment just exploded into activism. That was kind of what happened in a much more violent sense among the natives, where the resentments that they'd held for many years of being treated so unfairly, being cheated out of their land, being blamed for every crime, this just exploded into a conflict. And everywhere Philip escaped to, he gained followers. And so over the next several months in 1675, he gained a lot of followers, to the extent that almost all the natives in central Massachusetts joined his side. We don't think that Philip was he wasn't the kind of person who was like a general, but he did inspire a lot of the natives, including people in the praying towns. And the war went on for about a year. And in the first 6 to 7 months, the English were freaking out because the natives could attack anywhere they wanted. And the English were unable to fight back. They were so inept at the woodland warfare. And so for the first 6-7 months, essentially the natives were winning. And this was almost like an independence movement in a way that looked like in the English sources, especially in Rhode Island, they actually said this kind of thing. Maybe we're going to have to evacuate. Like maybe these colonies aren't going to work out. And Philip's movement among the natives kept growing, and certainly was a nightmare for the English colonists who felt under threat. And so attack after attack happened in the first several months, and then the English went to the Mohawks and they said, hey, we'll pay you whatever it takes to not join Philip's forces, and instead fight him. And that bribery ended up working. The Mohawks were traditional enemies of the Southern Algonquians anyway, and they ended up attacking Philip when he went to seek more allies around the end of 1676. End of 1675, beginning of 1676. After that, Philip was on the defensive, and there was this relentless campaign to attack his food supplies, any Wampanoag civilians, and eventually he was surrounded and killed. We don't know exactly what he looked like. So in the film, it had him look in a certain way. We don't know if he looked like that or not. All of these are artist renderings of him that are probably not very accurate. And he ended up losing his support. Once he started losing, he lost his access to weapons and supplies, eventually lost his allies, and the English started bribing more and more natives to fight on their side. And so the Wampanoags were systematically destroyed, essentially many of them captured, sent into slavery, or sold into slavery. And Philip himself was killed in August of 1676. And that his death signified the end of the major part of the fighting, which had gone on for a year, or a little more than a year. But it did continue among the Abenakis in Maine and some of the other natives in different northern New England, which was very... it was very desperate fighting that went on for some time. The results were significant. Approximately 10% of the English population was killed. We don't have exact numbers, but it was a lot. To put that into context, if we lose 3,000 people in Iraq, Americans freak out. This is about 1 out of 10 were killed or displaced by the fighting in the colonial towns. Among the natives, it was even worse. The natives lost about 50%, 50 to 60% of their population, with another significant percentage being captured and then sold into slavery. So for the southern Algonquins, it was disastrous for their situation in their homelands. And the results were extremely dire for them. Like I said, many of them sold into slavery. The ones who were not had to completely acquiesce to the English. And the significance going forward, in which we're going to see more and more as we go forward in time, is that colonists that later became Americans, they started to perceive natives as these savage devil warriors that could not be negotiated with and have to be completely driven out. They either have to be completely subjugated or completely driven out. There's no more, or there was still some, but there was less, we can all get along kind of feeling that the Puritans had initially had when they first showed up in Massachusetts. So the pattern set by King Philip's War did continue later. So that displacement, the war and displacement I talked about with the example of Eunice Williams, this was displacement on a massive scale. You have to kind of reforge your community as best you can when that kind of thing happens. And now your community is under a different kind of pressure because you've got less leverage, less power to push back with.